bunch of them here. That big arrow says that last night I took out the part about CNS infections. That's going to be a separate lecture. There are only 12 objectives here. On the one you have, there's how many? 13? Yeah, 13. Okay. So there you go. Histology of the nervous system. Oh wow, we already know that the neurons function a unit, and there are a lot of neurons. There are even many more glial cells, the supporting cells, in the central nervous system. If you look there, 100 million neurons in the spinal cord, and 5 times that many in the gut. So the enteric nervous system is quite complicated. There are differences between the central and peripheral nervous system, especially in how an axon is myelinated inside the central nervous system, which consists of the brain, the cerebellum, or the cortex, the cortices, the right and left cortices, the right and left cerebellar hemispheres, and the brainstem, and the spinal cord. That's the central nervous system. The rootlets and the dorsal roots and all the autonomic nerves and the dorsal ganglia, they're all part of the peripheral nervous system. So in the central nervous system, the myelinating cell type is the oligodendrocyte. In the peripheral nervous system, it's the Schwann cell. So that's really one of the biggest differences. In myelinated cells, myelinated axons, you have the wrap is here, and in the next cell, the wrap will be there, and the next cell, the wrap is there. So that between the myelinated cells, there's a bare area of axon. So in neural transmission of a myelinated axon, in a myelinated axon, the transmission, the action potential doesn't actually go down the length of the axon. It hops from one bare area to the next. Well, it doesn't really hop over, it hops underneath, or inside the cell, or inside the axon. So instead of just going like that, it goes bum, 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 bum. That's called saltatory conduction. SALTA, saltatory conduction, is what you'll see in myelinated axon. The myelin essentially speeds up the action potential process from 2 meters a second to 200 meters a second when you're using saltatory transmission. Professor Falk, I'm sure, will cover that when she does physiology. If you look at the axons here, and here's a Schwann cell, an early Schwann cell, it just encompasses, if that's the axon, it just initially encompasses the cell like that. And then it starts, the 2 membranes of the Schwann cell just meet and start wrapping inside of each other, like a crescent roll or something like that. And then once it gets wrapped multiple times, it starts tightening down, extruding the exoplasm out, so that what you're left with here is a series of plasma membranes right next to each other. That's not a solid black line. If you were to look at this on your computer, in Google Images, you'll see the lamellae of the different wraps of the Schwann cell. Anyway, that's how it does. A Schwann cell will, in the periphery, will only wrap one axon. But in the central nervous system, an oligodendrocyte will wrap multiple axons. It'll wrap one over here, it'll wrap one down there, and so on. Okay. This is a picture of an unmyelinated axon. I showed it to you yesterday, or sometime this week. Here's the nucleus of the Schwann cell, or oligodendrocyte. You see that each little seed fiber is wrapped by one layer of Schwann cell, but it's not wrapped repeatedly. There is a saltatory conduction in unmyelinated fibers. And these are the fiber types you're going to see with the seed pain fibers versus the postganglionic autonomics. Here's the illustration showing the Schwann cells here of a peripheral nerve, called peripheral axon, and these would be the nodes of Ranvier, which is where the saltatory conduction occurs. You can see these nodes on a light micrograph. This is just a light micrograph. You can see the little bars representing the places where two Schwann cells are meeting. The synapse itself was only discovered back in the 50s with the advent of the electron microscope. I think I may have mentioned that before. The synapse is a very specialized junction between two neurons, or a neuron in a muscle cell. In this illustration here, this transmission electron micrograph here, you can see the presynaptic membrane here with all the vesicles, synaptic vesicles clustering on it, and the postsynaptic membrane, and on the pre and postsynaptic membrane there's an electron dense area, so that's how you know that's the synapse. The gap between the pre and postsynaptic membrane here is only a few nanometers, so it's very, 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 very narrow. Okay? During synaptic transmission, these vesicles will dock with the membrane here, and the contents of the vesicles will dump into the synaptic cleft. If you look at the number and the complexity, if you look at the number of synapses in the nervous system, central nervous system, and try to imagine how complex it is, it says right there, every cubic millimeter contains 1 billion synapses. That is a lot of communication going on. And there's no wonder that repair of the central nervous system, it doesn't really happen. It's just too complex. All right? When you're talking about synapses, they can be between essentially any of the parts of a neuron. The typical one we think of is an axodendritic synapse. But in some neurons, they have, if this is the dendrite, they'll grow these little spines. And they can grow these spines in a matter of minutes, and you can form new synapses on the dendritic spines. So you can have axospinous synapses. The synapses can occur on the body, axosomatic, or they can occur on an axon. This neuron can synapse on the axon of that neuron, axo-axonic. And the purpose of these types of synapses, especially axo-axonic, is that the neurotransmitter is modulating the downstream neuron. So there's most of the nervous system is due to modulation, not the creation of action potentials itself. Okay? If you look at it globally. Now there's some terms and concepts you need to know in the nervous system. One of them here is synaptic plasticity. Synaptic plasticity means that, well, there is some ability of the nervous system to change. The synaptic connections in your nervous system to change. We can't seem to direct it very well, but the neurons can seem to. One example is, when you're born, you have a set number of neurons. When you're an adult, you have the same number of neurons. But you've had 30 years of memories. You didn't build 30 years of neurons to store those memories. You had the same neurons. Something had to change within the neurons that you were born with. And that's called synaptic plasticity. That's one of the deals with synaptic plasticity. That there must be synapses that form or synapses that go away so that neurons can modulate each other to different degrees. Okay, so let's, on top of that, look at synaptic strength. Synaptic strength. Synaptic strength means that, and you can use synaptic strength along with long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation says that if I synapse on Ron here, and I excite Ron, boom, one action potential excites Ron. The relationship here can change, there is plasticity, can change, so that the next time I excite Ron, he doesn't just burst once, he has a string of action potentials. Okay? So that I have done something to make him change so that the change becomes longer. It's more pronounced. That's long-term potentiation, summarized. Synaptic strength means how much we build that relationship. Let me ask you a question. One of the things about synaptic strength is, before I ask you the question, is the more you study something, the more you can remember it, right? You're putting things from short-term memory into long-term memory. How do you do that? You change synapses. You strengthen the synaptic relationship between neurons. Okay? The more you think about something, the more you can remember it 10 years from now. If you can, I'll give you an example. Here's the thing. If you can remember the name of your first grade teacher, raise your hand. Wow, just about every hand goes up in here. If you can remember the name of your geography teacher in the 7th grade, raise your hand. Maybe a dozen of you. The reason is, your whole life, you always remember your first grade teacher. Who gives a shit about the guy that taught you geography, PE, you know, he was the wrestling coach in the 7th grade? Nobody. And if you did, well, you're not right. Okay? So that's an example of long-term potential, that's a synaptic strength right there. Quantal release of neurotransmitter is when that synaptic vesicle docks with the presynaptic vesicle and dumps its contents in the cleft. You say that the amount of transmitter, we're going to designate it as 1 quanta. 1 quanta will create what's called a minimal excitatory postsynaptic potential. You don't have to write all that down. Just remember, think of it this way. Think of it more conceptual. So you know that the resting membrane potential for a neuron is like minus 60 millivolts, something like that, right? So here's minus 60. Here's the resting membrane potential of a neuron. So if you do something to raise that, if you raise it far enough, you're going to cause suddenly the ion shift, and you're going to create an action potential. So this right here represents 1 quanta. This does not generate an action potential. 1 vesicle released into the synapse will not create an action potential in the downstream neuron. No. You need to add these quanta so that you eventually get up to the millivolts that will cause the nerve to propagate an action potential. That's what quantal release of neurotransmitter is. And actually, I'm showing that you can facilitate neurotransmission. You can actually use something like gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, which drives the membrane deeper. So it makes it more difficult to depolarize. And then you can have some areas where you have axons that are depolarizing and axons that are hyperpolarizing. And it depends on how much input you get from the other, so what happens to that downstream neuron. So it's not as simple as this nerve excites that nerve. It's much more complicated than that. Okay? Those things like GABA, things that jack with neurotransmission, those are called neuromodulators. Acetylcholine, norepinephrine, those are neurotransmitters. Neuromodulators are things like GABA, substance P, there's a whole list of them, a whole list of them. I don't even want to go into them. Okay? All right, any questions about any of that? All right, synaptic vesicles here. The way you get this thing here, and we've got a norepinephrine containing adrenergic nerve terminal here, is by a process called a docking protein. There's two types of docking proteins. One of them is on the synaptic vesicle, the other one is on the presynaptic membrane. So this docking protein allows the vesicle to attach to the synapse, the presynaptic membrane. When it does, remember you're talking about membrane structures that look like that. You know, lipid bilayers, phospholipid bilayers. So what you're going to have to do, here are the docking proteins, you're going to have to open up or merge this phospholipid bilayer into the membrane here. You're going to have to fuse it so that the phospholipids line up and it dumps. So if that's the thing, right, this is the membrane and I'm the vesicle, it's going to have to fuse with it and open up like that. Well, if we keep adding vesicular membrane to the terminal is going to be the size of Dallas. You got to get rid of membrane. And the way you get rid of membrane is the way you get rid of the neurotransmitters. Let's pick them back up. So over here, laterally in the nerve terminal, you get membrane pinching back into the cell containing used neurotransmitter. And in those membranes, that's where you have things like monoamine oxidase or COMT that will degrade the neurotransmitter that you don't need. Or you can reuse it. In certain diseases, especially depression, what you want to do is increase the amount of neurotransmitter available in this to the postsynaptic membrane, which is where all the receptors are going to be, right? So what you want to do is do something to either block the degradation of the neurotransmitter or block its reuptake. MAO inhibitors are an old line antidepressant. If you block MAO, you have more, theoretically, more norepinephrine to remain in the synaptic cleft. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's what they do. They block the reuptake of serotonin, increasing the amount of serotonin or norepinephrine in the synaptic cleft, improving your depression. Okay, that's the theory behind it anyway. I mean, everybody in here, I mean, might as well admit it, everybody in here is on an SSRI. So there you go. That's what's happening to you. Now, one other thing about, now most receptors are of course going to be on the postsynaptic membrane. Alpha-2 receptors, though, in terms of the noradrenergic system, are on the presynaptic membrane. And the purpose for those alpha-2 receptors is that they block norepinephrine release. So there's a presynaptic membrane receptor modulating the activity of that synapse. All right, glia. There are a whole bunch of types of glia. The most prominent type are the astrocytes. There are two types of astrocytes. There are fibrous astrocytes and protoplasmic astrocytes. I don't really care that you know that. Fibrous astrocytes are more common in one area than the other, but just know that the astrocytes come in two forms. Astrocytes essentially connect neurons to the bloodstream. They act as to shuttle nutrients back and forth to the neurons. They act to support the neurons neutrally and nutritionally. Oligodendrocytes we've already talked about. These are the myelin-producing cells in the CNS. Microglia are the phagocytes of the CNS. They go in there and clean up damage. Microglia. And finally, you have the ependymma line the ventricles. These are things that are responsible for the ventricular nervous system barrier. It's a type of glial cells. These things collectively form the scaffold in which the neurons are placed. Here's a beautiful picture of all the different types of glia up there. There's another type of glial cell that you'll find in the periphery, like around dorsal root ganglion cells. These are called satellite cells. And that's basically the only place you find them are in the dorsal root ganglia. This illustration here just shows, if you can see it on your computer better, it shows blue and brown, there's just tons of neurons in here, and even more, the bluish things are the glial cells. Here's a relationship between astrocytes and neurons. You see that most of the exchange of nutrients here is in the order of amino acids. Amino acids for nutrition. Yeah, you think this slide is a piece of work. You wait till we get to the inborn errors of metabolism at the end. That's an impressive slide. Okay, nervous system injury. Well, you've got some problems. You've got some things that work against the nervous system here. One of them is a very high oxygen demand because of a high metabolic rate. 25% of your cardiac output goes to the central nervous system. I've said that 50 times. There you go. It doesn't take much to make your brain hypoxic. Immunologically privileged behind the blood-brain barrier. Understand that if something gets behind the blood-brain barrier, because the blood-brain barrier exists, you can't reach it. Your immune system can't reach it unless there's a breach in the blood-brain barrier. So if you had, for example, some type of abscess here or folliculitis that wound up, or like the thing on your face, if that got into your nervous system, you can't reach it. It's difficult to reach. It's difficult to reach with antibiotics because of the blood-brain barrier. Another problem is that glucose is the only fuel for the central nervous system. You can't use anaerobic metabolism. You can't use fats to fuel the brain. It only runs on glucose. You don't have to have the glucose transporter proteins to get sugar into the brain. It infuses in there without energy. So that's good. That's a good thing. But the bad thing is it's only glucose. So if you're in an anaerobic metabolic state like diabetic ketoacidosis, it's not good. Things are not good. All right. Targeted by a number of viral and chemical insults because of the high number of receptors to those viruses and to those chemicals. The thing about HIV is that, I can treat you for HIV to get your viral load down to undetectable. But because neurons have such a huge number of receptors for HIV, the HIV genome is throughout your nervous system. You may have eliminated the virus from your peripheral blood, but it is living well in your central nervous system. You will never get rid of it. Herpes, same thing. That genome is in your nervous system. Okay? Factors that contribute to neurologic symptoms. There are a couple of things here. The size of the lesion is obvious. The bigger it is, usually the worse it is. However, if the location is bad, it doesn't take much of the size of a lesion to cause a devastating problem. You can have a lesion the size of a ping pong ball in your frontal lobe, and you don't even know it, versus having a lesion the size of a pea in your mesencephalon, and you're dead. So location, location, location is the thing. The momentum of the lesion is also an issue. We'll talk about astrocytomas here in a minute. There are 4 degrees of astrocytoma. The first 3 are slow growing. The 4th type is fast growing. You're going to die. You will die within a year if you have a grade 4 astrocytoma. Regardless of what you do, within a year, you will die, okay? Velocity is a big thing when it comes to tumors. Now, here's another thing that was not recognized until probably the 80s, is that when you have an injury to the nervous system, you have a direct injury, like from a bleed or a clot or something, a tumor. But the problem is, if you start killing these neurons, it's like pancreatitis. If you start killing these neurons, what's released are not pancreatic enzymes, they're neurotransmitters. And one of the predominant neurotransmitters of the cerebral cortex is glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So all of a sudden in this cerebral lesion, you've got the neurons are bathed in glutamate, they just action potential themselves to death. So hyperexcitability due to neurotransmitter release, primarily glutamate, not acetylcholine, but the glutamate is a big problem. Non-specific CNS reactions to injury. One of them is cerebral edema, and I made a change on this slide last night, because it says on yours vitamin B12. That's not right. It's thiamine. Thiamine. There are two things in cerebral edema. Well, there's a lot of cerebral edema going on out there, but two things you got to watch out for that you can induce pretty easily. One is if you have a diabetic in hyperosmolar state, their blood sugar is 550, and you start dropping their blood sugar, dumping insulin into them to drop their blood sugar. If you drop it more than 100 milligrams per deciliter an hour, the brain is going to start to swell because of the osmotic difference in glucose, and you'll kill them. So that's why you never drop the blood sugar at a rate faster than 100 milligrams per deciliter per hour. The second thing is if you have an alcoholic who is thiamine deficient, and you give them glucose, if you give them, if they come in comatose, and as part of a coma workup, the first thing you do is you give somebody an amp of D50, an ampule of 50% dextrose. It's a lot of dextrose, a lot of sugar. But you never give that without first giving them the 100 milligrams of thiamine. Because if the person happens to be an alcoholic and they're thiamine deficient, and you give them that glucose, their brain will swell until their head pops off. Okay? It's actually a condition called Korsakoff syndrome. Korsakoff syndrome. Korsakoff. Korsakoff syndrome. Increased intracranial pressure is another thing in terms of neural injury. Nervous system, as I mentioned yesterday, doesn't like compression or pressure at all. So the normal pressure inside the head is pretty low. But if you start increasing the pressure because of one of the 1,000 different reasons, the nervous system is going to shut down. And it's going to shut down proportional to the rise in pressure. The clinical presentation of a rising CSF pressure is listed here. Nuchal rigidity, they don't want to move their head, they get a headache, obviously they get a headache, they start getting a little loopy, and then of course the papilledema that we're trying to beat into your heads. Papilledema looks like this. You see the step off, I've mentioned that, between the vessels coming out of the disc. The other thing about papilledema is that the disc margins are blurred. They're not nice and sharp like you normally see. They're more blurred. Herniation syndromes from an increase in pressure, intracranial. There are three different levels of herniation syndrome. The first one here involves a herniation of one side underneath the falx cerebri to the other side. And the problem with this type of herniation, so in other words, if you have a space-occupying lesion over here, or some bleed going on over here, putting pressure, this thing is going to get pushed under the falx cerebri. The problem with that is that it usually it occludes the anterior cerebral artery, and you're going to wind up with weakness, paralysis, paresthesias of the lower extremities. Why lower extremities? Why lower extremities? Because remember the homunculus, your limbs, your lower extremities are in the midline, and you're looped back over top of the brain like that. Transtentorial or uncal herniations occur right here. That right there is the tentorium cerebelli, right, separating the occipital lobe from the cerebellum. This is the posterior cranial fossa here. So this is the uncus, it's a part of the temporal lobe. So the herniation is down. Because cranial nerves 3 and 4, and we'll go over this tomorrow, are right there. When it says it has disturbances in eye movements, it's 3 and 4 that you're messing with. Okay, 3 and 4. The vision also can be messed up because the posterior cerebral arteries that you know go to the occipital lobe from anatomy, and the occipital lobe is responsible for vision. We can have visual effects from uncal herniations as well. And finally, here also, they describe a weakness here because the pathways for corticospinal tract are right there. And we'll go over that tomorrow morning. The last layer is a herniation of the cerebellar tonsils. The cerebellar tonsils are the lower part of the cerebellum here. They actually herniate out through the foramen magnum. Unfortunately, right here in the medulla, you have these important centers that drive respiration and heartbeat. So you put pressure on those and you wind up with dead. Now, these types of herniations can not only occur due to increasing pressures in the brain, you can induce them by, if somebody has an increased pressure in the brain and you stick a needle in their lumbar spine and drain CSF, you're doing a lumbar puncture, a diagnostic lumbar puncture, all of a sudden, where is that pressure going to go? Down, and you're going to herniate mostly the cerebellar tonsils. Mostly it's the tonsils. So you always want to get a CT of the head before you do an LP if you suspect intracranial pressure, increased intracranial pressure by the papilledema that you've already looked at their eyeballs, right? Okay. Ventricles of the brain, you have 2 lateral ventricles that communicate through the interventricular foramina into a third ventricle. The third ventricle drains through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle inferiorly is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. So when we were talking about syringomyelia yesterday, and I was talking about the cystic structures that fill up in dilated central canal of the spinal cord, they're filled with CSF because it communicates here. Now the CSF that you make escapes the ventricular system here by 3 different holes. 2 lateral holes right there, and another one in the midline. I'll go over these tomorrow. I'll show you images tomorrow. But that's how you get the CSF out of the ventricles. So it bathes the brain spinal cord in the subarachnoid space. You reabsorb it because you make it continuously. You reabsorb it through what little mechanism? You remember these little cute little things up here at the top of your, yeah, I know what it's written up there. Arachnoid granulations. That's how you get the CSF that you make a day, about 150 mils, back into the venous circulation. Here's a couple of examples of dilated ventricles. This is known as hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus, here, in this top case here, This was a slow, progressive hydrocephalus. This wasn't something that happened overnight. But of course, if you get hydrocephalus, if the ventricles start expanding, then they're going to put pressure on the nerves, the nervous system, the tracts and everything else, and it will eventually degenerate. It says here that you get hydrocephalus from an overproduction of CSF, rare. I don't think I've ever heard of that. It says more commonly decreased reabsorption, and that's true, but it's true because typically the flow of CSF is blocked. And the easiest place to block the flow of CSF is at its most narrow point, and that would be right here in the cerebral aqueduct, in the brainstem. The specific part of the brainstem is the mesencephalon, and I'll show you that tomorrow. If you wind up with hydrocephalus before the flat bones of your skull have fused, your head will get bigger. Back when I was growing up, it was probably a derogatory term, it was a derogatory term about kids. They were called waterhead babies because their heads would be so big and their ventricles would be so dilated. And this was before, of course, they invented shunts. You put a shunt in there and drain the CSF, run the shunt under the sub-Q space, and run it and put it in your peritoneum. So that's how you get rid of CSF. You either drain it to the thoracic cavity or drain it to the peritoneum.
So what do they do to prevent herniation whenever you're doing therapeutic lumbar puncture, like to relieve pressure? Is there something specific that they do just to prevent?
If you need to relieve pressure, you typically relieve it up here. Now maybe, I don't know what the neurosurgeons do, but there's a little valve actually that they put in your brain, in your skull. It's like a check valve that gets rid of that pressure. And it's actually kind of like a little tennis ball type thing. They put it in here and they got this little tennis ball hanging there, and it allows the CSF or whatever to drain. Not just CSF, but blood or effusion due to trauma. There are a whole bunch of reasons to do that. Okay. Therapeutic lumbar puncture for an increased intracranial pressure.
I had just seen one patient that had it done, so I was curious.
Yeah, I don't know anybody, I mean, maybe they do it. I've never heard anybody do that. Now, after the bones are fused, though, you've got to get that shunt in place. And there are typical headache, vomiting, and nausea. Very common symptoms with increased pressure here. Okay? Normal pressure hydrocephalus is a condition in older people, like 70, 80, 90 years old. What happens in that is that the ventricles start dilating, but the pressure is normal. And the ventricles start dilating, especially with things like Alzheimer's disease, where you have the neural mass is getting smaller, the ventricles get bigger. Okay? And it's called normal pressure hydrocephalus because if you're measuring the pressure in an LP, it's the same. It's normal. Right? But the problem with these people is they have a triad. The principal thing of the triad is worsening dementia, along with incontinence and gait disturbance. Those are the three things that you need to know for normal pressure hydrocephalus. And of course, advanced age is the other thing. Another term you may hear is hydrocephalus ex vacuo. V-A-C-U-O, I think is how you say it. And basically what that says is that hydrocephalus, because the cranial vault is vacated of neural tissue, like in the case of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, this mimics Alzheimer's disease, except in Alzheimer's, You don't typically get the incontinence and the gait disturbance until much later on. Traumatic injury, well, a couple of things about traumatic injury here. If the skull gets crushed in, that's bad. This is bad, okay? If it's a non-displaced skull fracture like this, that's not so bad. It can be bad because you can wind up with a contra coup lesion like here, like is shown here. Remember that from anatomy, contra coup? That's what you see right there. You see damage on both sides of the brain. All right. Here's an example of a skull fracture in a plain film. That's why you never get plain films if you're trying to rule out a skull fracture. They look just like the lines of the middle meningeal artery. Get a CT, a non-contrast CT of the head. If we go back here, you got to remember that when you start cracking the skull, because of how tightly, especially the middle meningeal artery is applied to the inside, and the skull is thinnest right here, you can wind up ripping that vessel. Also, because of the proximity of the cranial vault to the ears, to the nose, to the eyes, if you start cracking the skull into those areas, especially the nose, you can wind up with all those nasal bacteria up inside your brain. Not a good thing. And you remember that image of the basilar skull fracture back in anatomy with the raccoon eye, battle sign back here, hemotympanum. Okay. I was talking to Bob Oldham last night. He's the PA that runs the Antlers ER. They had a 11-year-old that was in a ATV accident. He had an 11-year-old. They didn't. He did. Because he's the only one there. And the ATV, they went up a hill, and it came over and landed on his skull. And of course, it crushed his skull. And so every time they would do chest compressions, blood and CSF was coming out his ears. So, obviously he didn't make it. But these things can be pretty brutal.
Okay.
Concussion. Concussion is what I just gave myself when I slapped myself in the head. It's it doesn't really produce visible neurological injury to the nervous system. It just rattles the brain a little bit. It sort of resets things. You wind up with amnesia, both retrograde and anterograde, for a brief period of time. Like, whoa, what happened? And where am I? That sort of thing. That's what you see somewhere up there. Retrograde and anterior. Confusion, disorientation. If it only happens once, big deal. You'll get over it. There's a concussion protocol when you're in sports. We'll go over it in musculoskeletal segment. There's a concussion protocol for when, like a football player or a basketball player or girls volleyball, whatever, can go back into sports. But if it's just a singular event, it's not that great a deal. It's when it happens over and over, it's when it becomes a great deal. In the news recently with the NFL football players, and I'll bring this up sometime tomorrow or Friday, on the repeated head injuries, and also happens to soccer players with heading. That's why they don't allow it in the little pee-wee soccer anymore. The dementia pugilistica is the term given to punch drunk, older fighters who have had a career of getting hit in the head too many times, and they just act a little bit goofy. If you look at Muhammad Ali, early, after he had retired, but early after he retired, everybody thought he was punch drunk. Actually, what his problem was Parkinson's disease. It just hadn't manifested itself yet. If you go and look at, if you do a YouTube video of Leon Spinks or some of these older heavyweight fighters, not George Foreman, he's my idol, but some of the not so great heavyweights, you can see that they've got that elevator doesn't go all the way to the top. And it actually has a name, dementia pugilistica. Traumatic injury, the worst one here, the worst one to deal with, is shaken baby syndrome. And basically, this does produce neurologic injury, especially to the frontal lobes and to the tips of the temporal lobes, because they sit there against the wall of the middle cranial fossa, and then of course the occipital lobes sitting on top of the tentorium back here. So the shaken baby syndrome is just a bad issue here in Oklahoma. We see a lot of it here. Okay. Now let's talk about the meninges here in bleeds a little bit. You remember the meninges and how they look in the brain. The dura actually has two layers. If we look at the dura up here, it has a periosteal layer. It's that layer that's adhered to the back of the underside of the bone. Remember how hard that was to peel off of there? It's actually attached with little fibrous spicules. And then there's a meningeal layer. This is the meningeal layer you're looking at here. Here's the periosteal layer that's peeled up right there. This is a potential space. This is not a real space. It's potential space. Because underneath this is the arachnoid. Directly underneath this is the arachnoid. So this is actually going to be inflated with CSF. Now the point I want to make here is if you look over here on this side right here, there's the middle meningeal artery. And an arterial or epidural bleed occurs above the periosteal dura. It peels the dura off of the bone. That's an epidural hematoma. These are usually arterial. A subdural hematoma is between the periosteal and the meningeal layer, and it's usually venous. You see all these blue vessels here, it's usually venous. So a subdural hematoma is venous, typically. If we look at them here, here's some illustrations. You can't really tell if that's an epi or subdural hematoma in that CT. You're going to have to do more than just a CT. But here's an explanation for it here. Because it's arterial, they usually become symptomatic much faster, and you usually have to, if it's a medical emergency, you need to get them to a neurosurgeon by helicopter and get that skull opened up and the bleeder closed off. A subdural hematoma, you have a lot more time to deal with it because it's usually a slow growing bleed. You know, when little Junior fell off out of the crib, bumped his head on the floor, and they bring the child in. You know, the child acts just perfectly happy, but subdurals can grow over time. So what you want to advise the parents here, if you're going to send the kid home, what you're going to advise the parents is every 2 hours go into the room and just shake the baby. Don't wake the baby, just shake the baby and make sure that the baby moves or responds. You can also do it in your own kids. You know, your 6-year-old gets a bump on the head, then this is called a neurocheck. Advise the parents on doing a neurocheck overnight, throughout the night. If he starts vomiting, complains of headache, vision changes, then get him back up here. Or if you can't arouse him, get him back up here. These things can take actually months to build up. They can be so slow growing. Now, if you did an LP, understand that you're not going to get a bloody tap with an epidural or a subdural hematoma. You will only get a bloody tap if it's a subarachnoid hemorrhage. If the hemorrhage is deep to the arachnoid membrane, where the CSF is. Trauma is the most common cause. Subarachnoid and subdurals usually don't wind up with skull fractures. Epidurals almost uniformly you will. Hypoxic encephalopathy is a very fancy term to just mean that your brain, your consciousness, or your brain, You lose consciousness, if you cut off blood circulation to the brain, you're gonna lose consciousness within 6 seconds. If that circulation is cut off for more than a few minutes, you're gonna wind up start killing neurons. The most sensitive neurons here are the ones in the temporal lobe at the area called the hippocampus. I'll show you that later next week, where the hippocampus is and what it does. But one of the primary things it does is memory. And these people have a pretty significant problem with ability to form new memories. The thing here, cold is better than warm, relates to the northern climates in particular, Michigan, Minnesota, where the kid falls through the ice and stays submerged for an hour, completely anoxic for an hour, and they get him back, they warm him up, they give him oxygen, and 2 days later he walks out of the hospital like nothing ever happened. But he was underwater for an hour. That stimulates what's called the mammalian diving reflex. It shuts your cardiovascular system down, shuts your nervous system down. It's what, if you happen to be a whale, you're going to die. No, the whales are not mammals. Yeah, whales are mammals. Yeah, if you're going to be a whale, kill a whale and you're going to dive to 20,000 feet, you can't do it with a fast heartbeat. You got to slow things down to get down there, right? Mammalian diving reflex. If it never happens in warm water, the kid will die. The kid will die. The younger you are, the better chance you have of surviving it. Adults can survive it, but it's much more common in children. Okay? In fact, one of the ways to slow a kid's heart rate down is to throw ice water in his face. Or take an ice cold face cloth and put it on his face, and it slows his heart rate down. So, let me see what's next. Okay, take a break and then we'll come back.